Welcome to Freedom First. This is Jeffrey Tucker. Today we're going to talk about censorship. It seems like a conventional subject, but I'm under the impression, I think it's correct, that a lot of people misunderstand this topic. So I'd like to spend some time unpacking it just a little bit. Now, all my friends around the world say that Americans are extremely lucky because we have a First Amendment. It's written in the Bill of Rights that Congress cannot inhibit the free flow of ideas, intervene in speech at all. It's a guarantee for us. And most countries in the world don't have such a thing. Now, just because it's in there, and I should add, too, that it was written, the Bill of Rights came about separately from the Constitution. It was a compromise position because a lot of people at the founding period were very suspicious of this new thing called the central government, the federal government that was being created, and didn't believe that it would maintain its place as just a caretaker of the U.S. system, and insisted on the Bill of Rights as part of it as a way of directly limiting what the government can and cannot do. The First Amendment protects speech and religion, which were the two most important things to the Founding Fathers. So they were written as part of the document, and that document was embedded as part of the Constitution. And that's the only way the Constitution got ratified. The Bill of Rights itself was ratified in 1791. But just to illustrate how fragile the right of free speech is, I would like to tell some stories about American history just to get a sense of this, and also help you understand what it is that free speech is all about. So in 1798, President John Adams signed a bill put forward by Congress called the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Sedition Act in particular made it, against the law, a criminal offense to make fun of or criticize or otherwise disagree with the president, the Congress, or other government officials, or government generally speaking. And that was 1798, so this is already an aggressive rolling back of the First Amendment against free speech rights. It would have put editors of newspapers, it's how people would have criticized the president in those days through newspapers. If you stood up on a soapbox, public park, or criticized somebody in a beer hall, it's not going to matter. What really matters is the distribution system, the newspapers at the time. So many newspaper editors were arrested and accused of violating the Sedition Act. Well, this was very controversial at the time, and a lot of people had a sense that this is not consistent with the American system. This sounds like what they used to do in old Europe, which is true. So Jefferson ran who was the vice president, conspicuously excluded from the act. A lot of people thought, oh, okay, great. I can't criticize Adams, but I can criticize Jefferson. That's the way it was written, right? Welcome to politics. Ran against the Sedition Act and won the presidency in 1800, which was a great development in American history because already you could see government consolidating, getting bigger, violating people's rights. The election of 1800 is very important to American history because it said decisively, no, Americans stand for freedom. After all, Jefferson was the guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence. He, of all people, would have been the one most aware of what it is we're trying to do in this country and why it matters. So his presidency was a big deal in American history. Probably saved freedom in America, actually, from the John Adamses. Anyway, so one of his first actions was to repeal the Sedition Act and guarantee the right of free speech. Now, we learned from this early experience that that's what is at issue. It's not so much literal speech, like anybody can say whatever they want, anywhere they want. What you cannot do under censorship laws is use the technology to reach masses a number of people in ways that affect the public mind and therefore change political culture and therefore threaten the people in power. You see what I mean? That's what's the issue. The issue is, can you reach multitudes of number of people? And the way you prevent that is by controlling the means of delivering this information, the distribution systems. And that's what it's always been, every time. So in 1835, the southern states that allowed slavery lobbied Congress and got them to pass a censorship law that did, in fact, restrict the ability of any southern newspaper editors, once again, publish anything that was in favor of the abolition of slavery or the emancipation of slaves. And that law went through. I mean, slavery was not just a problem in the southern states, it was a problem for the whole United States. Congress very much involved itself in protecting the slaveocracy. As appalling as that is what a black mark that is in American history. This really happened in 1835. That law maintained its power all the way up to 1849, when finally it was repealed. So that was a long period of censorship. Nonetheless, the anti-slavery movement grew. Well, 11 years later, once Lincoln was elected on what was in effect an abolitionist platform, he denied it. Other people suspected it. The people who suspected it were right. But after the firing on Fort Sumter by the Confederate powers, the nation was at war. Immediately, Lincoln imposes new censorship rules. This time, of course, it did the opposite. It made it illegal to praise the Confederacy or denounce the war draft in the North. Because the draft for the war in the North is very unpopular. There were riots in New York, very famous ones, against the draft. A lot of people were being taken off boats and, as immigrants, and immediately put into the uniform to go fight the Confederate States. And people didn't like that. So there were protests. Well, Lincoln made it illegal to criticize the draft. So that really happened. And once again, newspaper editors were jailed, and there was a major problem. Well, after the war, that went away, and we had a long period of free speech in this country, and that was a very good thing. But when the war came along, namely the Great War, World War I, Wilson imposed, again, restrictions on free speech, on writers and editors in particular. They're the ones that were at issue. Of course, they're always the ones at issue. And it was so bad, like as a publisher of a magazine or the editor of a newspaper, you could not denounce the war, question U.S. motives for going to war, or otherwise. In fact, there's a famous case of one of my favorite writers, H.L. Mencken, who was very prominent before the Great War and then afterwards. During wartime, he didn't have anything to do. He was against the war, but he couldn't write about it. So instead, he wrote a 3-volume history of the American language, just to keep himself busy, right? That's how bad it was. Well, after the war, that restriction was eliminated. And then years later, actually not too many years later, but there was a Red Scare in this country because of the Bolshevik Revolution. There was a perception that we had Bolsheviks in America, and there's a lot of hysteria about this and a lot of investigations and a real chilling impact on speech. Nobody wanted to be outed as a red, obviously. When the New Deal came along, FDR, and we know this from a new book by the historian David Beto, has tracked down many ways in which FDR himself used his powers as the president to lean on newspaper editors and get them not to publish certain things and publish other things. There was, in effect, censorship going on, not by legislation, but by actions of the president to restrict what ideas the Americans heard. And the ideas that FDR did not want Americans to hear were his own, of course, his critics, right? So once again, the same thing, using the power of government to restrict the free flow of ideas in order to shore up a particular president or regime and its political priorities. That's what censorship is about. Same thing happened in World War II. Suddenly, and this was by legislation and emergency legislation, the federal government presumed the right to read everybody's mail and to listen in to everybody's conversations to make sure that nobody was saying anything that was contrary to the war effort. There was the same period where we had internment of Japanese citizens in the U.S., and then, of course, a big move against German Americans and an attempt by the government to find out who was being sympathetic with the enemy. That was World War II. Then after the Second World War, when Russia suddenly became the new enemy again because of communism and its threat, we were allies during World War II, but suddenly the communists were the threat, that's when we saw McCarthyism rise up in the early 1950s. And with that came the censoring of Hollywood, newspapers, and other mechanisms of reaching the public. Now, but I speak of technology here. It really had a huge impact on technology. We're going to get to the modern period in a bit, but just quickly. In the early 1920s, the radio was invented and homes started getting radios. immediately Congress passed legislation that created the Federal Radio Commission that heavily regulated what could be on the radio, right? So you have government involvement there. When the TV was invented, the Federal Radio Commission was converted to the Federal Communications Commission, just in case there would be other inventions besides the TV that could keep changing the name. So now it's all communications had to be regulated by the federal government. And they did that. And they accomplished that. I mean, when I was a little boy, this country, the United States, had free television stations, ABC, NBC, and CBS. And those television stations ran 30 minutes of news a night. So you turn it on, and all the news is exactly the same on all three channels, more or less, just different anchors, different personalities, but basically the same thing. 5 minutes were devoted to weather, 5 minutes to sports, 5 minutes to local news. Then the rest of the time, 15 minutes, was divided between national news and international news. Now, I was raised with the idea that this was the news. You want to know what the news is? Just watch these 10 minutes, these 15 minutes, and then you've got the news. There's no other news that you should be concerned about. And I have to tell you, I don't think that anybody in that whole generation, it ever occurred to them, gee, what am I missing? What am I not hearing? How much news is there that I'm not hearing? And why is that? Well, it's because under really good and effective censorship controls, you don't know what you're missing. You don't know what you're not hearing. That's the remarkable thing about it, and why censorship can be so insidious. Well, let's bump way forward in time, let's bump forward all the way to the invention of the internet. The web browser comes along in 1995. Now, anybody can create a website and put information out there of any sort. Blogs started being created, internet forums, email was going crazy. We started entering into a period of information anarchy. And this lasted for a very long time. Started getting really sophisticated after the turn of the millennium, and attempts to restrict the flow of ideas were kind of hopeless. And meanwhile, we started getting ever more access. Google was invented, Microsoft got software to everybody, and it was just free-for-all. Well, we should have anticipated this, but eventually the government would figure out a way around this so-called problem of everybody having access to so much information. And they did it through 3 steps. The first one was to consolidate the industry. So we have a new delivery system here called the internet. It makes every single person a potential source of news. I mean, YouTube. Oh, so now every person can have their own TV channel? Yeah, that was the idea. They're supposed to empower everybody, give everybody access to everybody else. Billions reaching billions. So that was the idea. Well, how do you overcome this if you're a government that wants to censor people? First, you consolidate the industries. You do that by erecting heavy barriers to entry into the market and making sure that only the most lucrative players could get in. So, and who were the lucrative, heavy, dominant players in tech at the time? Well, it became Facebook and Apple and later Twitter and Google, of course, and Microsoft. Okay, so those were the big players. Later, there were other things that came along like LinkedIn, which is a product of Microsoft, Pinterest, and so on. But there are all these other third parties that were operating. So they wanted to consolidate those up into smaller bundles. And they did that. I mean, the tech industry is now highly consolidated. The payment systems are highly consolidated. PayPal started off to being a way that anybody could send money to anybody else. Now it's just basically another online bank. So that was restricted very heavily. Bitcoin came along, by the way, to become a democratized form of money. That didn't last long. By 2013, there were heavy restrictions on who and what could be a money exchange. And how do you become a money exchange? You pay fees to the federal government, and you pay fees every single state government or any other government that was in which the exchanges would take place. That meant that only a handful of companies could ever afford to do that and become places that could host money exchanges. So there ended up just being a handful of these things where they should have been thousands and thousands. It was the same way with the internet generally. So that's the first thing. Consolidate the industry into a few bundles, then embed your employees within these companies in exchange relationships with lobbyists that would basically you would have the lobbyists that would arrange for payments to politicians who would then work with the regulators to regulate back. So everybody is working with everybody else now. And that's been going on, for the better part of 20 years. And once you get your employees embedded in there, and we know this from Elon Musk, when he took over Twitter, he said, look, Twitter 1.0 was basically a federal government operation. I mean, a ton of employees here were shadow working for the FBI. We know this now. They were censoring on behalf of the federal government. We have tens of thousands of pages of documentation to demonstrate this. Very, very dangerous. And then once you get those steps done, that's when you crack down. And you start deleting accounts that oppose regime priorities. You declare an emergency, say this is misinformation, this is disinformation, this is malinformation. We don't care if it's true or not. It's not consistent with our priorities as a nation. And that's what happened, especially after 2016, but very intensely once we hit the lockdown period of March 2020. That's when the censors got working in overdrive. So that's when you got your Facebook account deleted. That's when you got your Twitter account deleted. That's when your reach stopped on LinkedIn. That's when you'd post something on Pinterest and find that it was deleted by the moderators there. They were all working on behalf of the federal government. Now, this raises profound legal questions, as it always has in American history, always has raised profound legal questions. Typically, the courts have decided that the federal government cannot do indirectly what it cannot do directly, right? So here you have a case where Congress and the agencies are creating third-party structures, nonprofit organizations, or giving grants to university professors who in turn are working with social media companies to curate the kinds of information that people see. Again, the lesson is not so much about your ability to speak in the public park. It's not so much about, what you tell your friends at the beer hall. It's about how many people you can reach and the mechanisms by which you can reach them. That's what's at issue. So this is going on now very consistently to the point of creating what me and my colleagues have called the censorship industrial complex. It's a vast machine involving hundreds of institutions, if not thousands, and tens of thousands of individuals working for it. Everybody knows about it. It's been going on constantly. Well, it was hidden, but court documents, FOIA requests, and subpoenas from Congress have unearthed this. We know now, for example, that the Biden administration was writing and meeting with Amazon to delist, unpublish, and deboost books that were critical of the vaccine as being necessary, safe, and effective. All right? We know this now. We have all the information. We also know that the Biden administration used the National Science Foundation to promote censorship with big tech and other delivery mechanisms of information through universities and other nonprofit organizations and direct grants to social media companies. It's all there. It's all laid out. We have thousands, if not tens of thousands of pages of documents to prove this. It's quite damning. Well, as you might expect, there are people who complain about this, right? They are the plaintiffs in a major lawsuit that has been hit around the courts now a number of times. One court looked at the evidence and said, look, this is so outrageous, we need an immediate injunction to stop this nonsense. This has got to go. Well, that injunction, a stay was put on the injunction, and now it's being heard before the Supreme Court in March. We're going to hear oral arguments about the injunction. Depending on how this court decides this injunction will determine a lot about how the Supreme Court will treat the actual case when that comes along, which could be, God knows, 2 or 3 years from now. This is very, very dangerous because if the Supreme Court decides that it's okay for government agencies to work with third parties to curate the kinds of information to which you have access or throttle your ability to reach people with your opinions, that would give a license to the federal government to do whatever it wants with regard to free speech. I mean, that could be super devastating to the First Amendment. But if the Supreme Court decides that, there's nothing we can do about it. It could be a very grim, it's a very dangerous moment. On the other hand, if the Supreme Court decides, oh, agencies cannot do this, they cannot work with Amazon, they can't work with Microsoft, they can't tell Elon Musk at Twitter what to do, they can't embed the employees in Google and tell them what they can and cannot boost in terms of search results. If that happens, that would be a thrilling thing. It doesn't mean that we'll be totally safe from the censors forever, but it would be a major setback, not only for the Biden administration, but any other presidential administration that attempts this for many years to come. Now, these things wear down over time, as you know. Even the best court decisions begin to lose their teeth over time. Still, that would be a major step in the right direction. Let's hope that that happens. The reason for going through all this history is to explain to you that this is not just about literal speech. This is about the things that we believe about our country, who we are, what the kind of regime we're going to live under, what the laws should be. Are we really living in a participatory democracy in which the public rules itself through its elected representatives? Or do we have a bunch of deep state, bureaucrats working with the industry to throttle and control what we say to each other as a way of manipulating political outcomes? That's what's at issue. When you think about the importance of rights in America, or anytime, anywhere, free speech has to be right at the top of the list. Because if you cannot reach other people, then other people don't know you're not reaching them. You just think this is the way the world works. But with free speech, you have access to the full range of ideas. That is something that needs absolute firm protection and defense by the laws and the practices of every nation. So, join me in the struggle for free speech. It's critical, I think, to the future of civilization itself. Thanks for joining me for Freedom First. This is Jeffrey Tucker.